This is what we read last week. This is the end of 1 Maccabees 16, where it was talking about how I'm not going to read. Well, I guess I'll read 16 through 24 real quick. This 1 Maccabees 16, starting with verse 16, it says, "So when Simon and his sons had drunk largely, Ptolemy and his men rose up and took their weapons and came unto Simon into the banqueting place and slew him and his 2 sons and certain of his servants. In which doing he committed a great treachery and recompensed evil for good." All right, so that wicked Ptolemy. Then Ptolemy wrote these things and sent to the king that he should send him a host to aid him, and he would deliver him the country and the cities. He sent others also to Gezerah to kill John, and unto the tribunes he sent letters to come to him, that he might give them silver and gold and rewards, and others he sent to take Jerusalem and the mountain of the temple. Now one had run afore to Gezerah and told John that his father and brethren were slain, and quoth he, "Ptolemy hath sent to slay thee also." Hereof when he heard, he was sore astonished. So he laid hands on them that were come to destroy him and slew them, for he knew that they sought to take him or to make him away. Right? So that just says that John stopped the murderers from killing him. That doesn't say anything about what happened to Ptolemy, right? And it says, concerning the rest of the acts of John and his wars, worthy deeds which he did, and the building of the walls which he made, and his doings, behold, these are written in the chronicles of the his priesthood, from the time he was made high priest after his father. So we don't have those books in the Bible. So we gotta find a way to bridge the gap, right? So that's what I'm trying to do this week. All right. Now I'm going to be reading out of initially the complete works of Flavius Josephus. Here is the cover. There are different covers. This one that I got, and as you see, I got it on sale from it was either Barnes and Noble or a Christian bookstore. But this is the works of Josephus, complete and unabridged, with the blue cover. It's got the coin on the cover, translated by William Whiston. That's what I'm going to be reading out of initially. So I'm going to start with page 349. All right, I'm just showing page 349. Just to show what chapter we're reading out of initially, chapter 7. And this is just confirming the same thing that we just read in 1 Maccabees 16. Josephus says the same thing. It says, "How Simon confederated himself with Antiochus Pius, and made war against Trypho, and a little afterwards against Cendebeus, the general of Antiochus's army. Also how Simon was murdered by his son-in-law Ptolemy, and that by treachery." Right? That's what we just read about, how he was murdered by his son-in-law Ptolemy. All right. So this is on page 350. I'm going to start at number 226. When Simon heard of Antiochus breaking his league with him, although he were now in years, yet provoked with the unjust treatment he had met with from Antiochus, and taken a resolution brisker than his age could well bear, he went like a young man to act as a general of his army. He also sent his sons before among the most hardy of his soldiers, and he himself marched on with his army another way, and laid many of his men in ambushes in the narrow valleys between the mountains, nor did he fail of success in any one of his attempts, but was too hard for his enemies in every one of them. So he led the rest of his life in peace, and did also himself make league with the Romans. So I wanted to read that specifically, and I don't know if y'all remember last week whenever I was reading about how Antiochus turned on Simon. It kind of confused me because it was out of nowhere, right? And Josephus is just confirming the same things. I was like, surely this is not talking about Antiochus, the one he just made the league with. But yeah, it was. Antiochus just turned on him for no reason. All right. But keep in mind that he made a league with the Romans, as I've been establishing over the past few weeks, reading the Maccabees. First, it was Judas Maccabeus trying to make a league with the Romans. Then Jonathan confirmed it, and Simon confirmed it as well. But yeah, this next section or this next part, 228, talks about his death. Now he was ruler of the Jews in all 8 years, but at a feast came to his end. It was caused by the treachery of his son-in-law Ptolemy, who caught also his wife and 2 of his sons, and kept them in bonds. He also sent some to kill John the third son, whose name was Hyrcanus. All right. So Hyrcanus Some say Hyrcanus. It's it's the same thing. This is just the successor, the son of Simon, who was his successor in the high priesthood. All right. But the young man, perceiving them coming, he avoided the danger he was in from them and made haste into the city, Jerusalem, as relying on the goodwill of the multitude because of the benefits they had received from his father and because of the hatred of the same multitude bare to Ptolemy. So that when Ptolemy was endeavoring to enter the city by another gate, they drove him away, as having already admitted Hyrcanus, right? So they drove Ptolemy away. They didn't let him come to Jerusalem, obviously, because he had done wickedness. So we're going to pick up with this story in chapter 8. And we're going to read just about all of chapter 8 right here. It has the title, Hyrcanus receives the high priesthood and ejects Ptolemy out of the country. Antiochus makes war against Hyrcanus and afterwards makes a league with him. Right, so that's a summary of what we're about to read. All right, so Ptolemy retired to one of the fortresses that was above Jericho, which was called Dagon. But Hyrcanus, having taken the high priesthood that had been his father's before, and in the first place propitiated God by sacrifices, he then made an expedition against Ptolemy. And when he made his attacks upon the place in other points, he was too hard for him, but was rendered weaker than he by the commiseration he had for his, and I'm gonna go to the next page. He had for his mother and his brethren, and by that only. For Ptolemy brought them upon the wall and tormented them in the sight of all, and threatened that he would throw them down headlong unless Hyrcanus would leave off the siege. Right, so Ptolemy, he was a dirty man. All right, using dirty tactics. He's going to torture Hyrcanus's family if he doesn't stop the siege. All right, no honor at all in this Ptolemy, which, I mean, we already read how he did his treachery towards Simon. All right, that's how Josephus puts it. All right, leave off the siege, as he thought that so far as he relaxed to the siege and taking of the place. So much favor did he show to those that were dearest to him by preventing their misery. His zeal about it was cooled. Right, so Hyrcanus, he was like, okay, I'll stop the siege, just free my family. Right. Let's see, I guess these are verses, but it's part 232. However, his mother spread out her hands and begged of him that he would not grow remiss on her account, but indulge his indignation so much the more, and that he would that he would do his utmost to take the place quickly, in order to get their enemy under his power, and then to avenge upon him what he had done to those that were dearest to himself. So if you remember what we read about, it's in 2 Maccabees chapter 7, about the woman with her 7 sons. She told them, hey, take the torture and take it manfully, that we may be, granted with eternal life. His mother was the same way. All right, she was married to Simon. All right, so she already knew the scriptures. She said, look, let him torture me, but take the city. All right, take the city from him, that this wicked wretch can live no more. All right, but we'll see how that that encouraged him. That encouraged Hyrcanus to continue the siege. All right. And then to avenge upon him what he had done to those that were dearest to himself. For that death would be to her sweet, though a torment. She said, look, it'd be an honorable death if I die for the Lord here. All right. You don't have to do this on my account. All right. Avenge your brethren. All right. Let's see. If that enemy of theirs might but be brought to punishment for his wicked dealings with them. All right, part 233. Now, when his mother said so, he resolved to take the fortress immediately. But when he saw her, and he could not but sympathize, but when he saw her beaten and torn to pieces, his courage failed him. Right. So Ptolemy was an evil and wicked man that was torturing and tormenting this poor old lady. All right. That he could not but sympathize with what his mother suffered, and was thereby overcome. 234. And as the siege was drawn out into length by this means, that year on which the Jews used to rest came on. Right, a land Sabbath. Right, a 7th year Sabbath. All right. For the Jews observe this rest every seventh year, as they do every seventh day. Right. And that's exactly what the law says to do. 235. So that Ptolemy, being for this cause released from the war, he slew the brethren of Hyrcanus and his mother. And when he had so done, he fled to Zeno, who was called Codalus, who was then the tyrant of the city Philadelphia. Right. So this is the last we hear of Ptolemy. All right. He went to his friend Zeno Codalus, who was the tyrant of Philadelphia. All right. But Antiochus, being very uneasy at the miseries that Simon had brought upon him, he invaded Judea in the 4th year of his reign, and the 1st year of the principality of Hyrcanus, and the 162nd Olympiad. All right, so now this little B note right here tells you that Josephus got the year wrong. And, you know, I can't say whether he did or not, but I will say this, that the book of Josephus is not in the Bible for a reason. All right, he was not, you know, an all-out righteous man. He just knew a lot of history of the Jews, and you know, from time to time he said things to appease the Romans, and at other times he brought out the truth. In this case, we established that since this is not anything against the Romans specifically, this is against the Greeks. He's pretty much speaking the truth. All right. And when he had burnt the country, he shut up Hyrcanus in the city, which he encompassed round with 7 encampments, but did nothing at the first. Because of the strength of the walls and because of the valor of the besieged, although they were once in want of water, which yet they were delivered from by a large shower of rain, which fell at the setting of the Pleiades. However, about the north part of the wall where it happened, the city was upon a level with the outward ground. The king raised 100 towers of 3 stories high and placed bodies of soldiers upon them. And as he made his attacks every day, he cut a double ditch, deep and broad, and confined the inhabitants with it as within a wall. But the besieged contrived to make frequent sallies out. And if the enemy were not anywhere upon their guard, they fell upon them and did them a great deal of mischief. And if they perceived them, they then returned into the city with ease. Right. So neither one is really gaining an upper hand here. This war between Hyrcanus and Antiochus here. All right. But because Hyrcanus discerned the inconvenience of so great a number of men in the city, while the provisions were the sooner spent by them, and yet, as it natural to suppose, those great numbers did nothing, he separated the useless part and excluded them out of the city, and retained that part only who were in the flower of their age and fit for war. Right. So he told the people who could not fight, he said, "Hey, get out of the city," and he just left the men who could fight. All right, the adults. The adults, but not the elderly, right? So the men who were fit for war. However, Antiochus would not let those that were excluded go away, who therefore, wandering about between the walls and consuming away by famine, died miserably. So, and Antiochus was not letting them go away. All right, he was not letting them escape. But when the Feast of Tabernacles was at hand, those that were within commiserated their condition and received them in again, right? Because, you know, they were coming back for the feast. And when Hyrcanus sent to Antiochus and desired there might be a truce for 7 days because of the festival, he gave way to piety towards God and made that truce accordingly. Besides that, he sent in a magnificent sacrifice, bulls with their horns gilded, with all sorts of sweet spices, and with cups of gold and silver. So you could tell at this point, Antiochus was looking for a peace treaty. And, you know, it just so happened to come around the Feast of Tabernacles that Hyrcanus was like, look, we want to keep the feast. We don't want a war. We want to keep the feast at least for these 7 days. And he said, okay, I'll give you a sacrifice and you know, I'll give you gifts so that we can establish this peace. All right. So those that were at the gates received the sacrifices from those that brought them and led them to the temple. Antiochus, the meanwhile, feasting his army, which was a quite different conduct from Antiochus Epiphanes, right? So this Antiochus is different than, you know, the other Seleucid ruler, Antiochus Epiphanes. It's very different, all right? Who, when he had taken the city, offered swine upon the altar and sprinkled the temple with the broth of their flesh in order to violate the laws of the Jews and the religion they derived from their forefathers. You see that right there? So, obviously Antiochus Epiphanes was wicked and evil, and anytime he got the opportunity to, he sacrificed unclean meats. Whereas, this Antiochus was, sent a gilded horned, what did it say, ram or bullock? Bulls, right? Bulls with their horns gilded, right? So that's what he sent. He said, I want to establish a truce. I want to establish a peace treaty with you. I don't want to keep fighting. I don't want this to get out of hand any more than it already has. I'm going to send clean foods that I know that y'all can eat. All right. But very different than Antiochus Epiphanes. All right. For which reason our nation made war with him and would never be reconciled to him. But for, come on now, would never be reconciled unto him. But for this Antiochus, all men called him Antiochus the Pious, for the great zeal he had about religion, right? So that's how this man got his name. Antiochus Epiphanes called himself Epiphanes, he said, I'm God manifested on earth. This Antiochus got the name, he earned the name Antiochus the Pious, all right? Antiochus Pious, because he, did not want to be wicked towards the religion of Hyrcanus and the rest of the Jews, all right? So, yeah, we're already just about done with the 8th chapter. I'll go ahead and finish it out because I do want to get down to the end of this. Accordingly, Hyrcanus took this moderation of his kindly. And, accordingly, Hyrcanus took this moderation of his kindly. And when he understood how religious he was towards the deity, right, towards the Most High, he sent an embassage, and desired to him, embassage to him, and desired that he would restore the settlements that they received from their forefathers. So he's like, look, I'll even give you a couple cities, right? So he rejected the counsel of those that would have him utterly destroy the nation by reason of their way of living, which was to others unsociable, and did not regard what they said. But being persuaded that all they did was out of a religious mind, he answered the ambassadors that if the besieged would deliver up their arms and pay tribute for Joppa and the other cities which bordered upon Judea and admit a garrison of his on these terms, he would make war against them no longer. So, right. So they're trying to work out the terms of this peace treaty. All right. So, he understands, like, he's like, look, I understand that y'all are just doing this in the name of your religion. You're just doing this in the name of your culture, and I'm all right with that. But here's what you got to do for me if you want this war to end, right? And just like any kind of war is going to end with, any time a treaty is formed, there's going to be, demands or requests made by either side, and that's what's going on here. All right. But the Jews, although they were content with the other conditions, did not agree to admit the garrison because they could not associate with other people nor converse with them. Yet were they willing, instead of the admission of the garrison, to give him hostages and 500 talents of silver, of which they paid down 300 and lent the hostages immediately, which King Antiochus accepted. One of those hostages was Hyrcanus' brother, but still he broke down the fortifications that encompassed the city, and upon these conditions Antiochus broke up the siege and departed. You see that right there? So they said, look, we can't do that, but we can do this, and we can end it there. All right. So yeah, I do want to finish out chapter 8 and just start chapter 9 here. But Hyrcanus opened the sepulchre of David, who excelled all other kings in riches, and took out of it 3,000 talents. He was also the first of the Jews that, relying on this wealth, maintained foreign troops. All right. So Hyrcanus, he dipped into the riches that were in the sepulchre of the kings. All right. There was also a league of friendship and mutual assistance made between them, upon which Hyrcanus admitted him into the city, and furnished him with whatsoever his army wanted in great plenty, and with great generosity, and marched along with him when he made an expedition against the Parthians, of which Nicholas, where did I just get to? Okay, of which Nicholas of Damascus is a witness for us, who in his history writes thus: when Antiochus had erected a trophy at the river Lycus upon his conquest of Endates, or of Endatus, the general of the Parthians, he stayed there 2 days. It was at the desire of Hyrcanus the Jew, because it was such a festival, derived to them from their forefathers, whereupon the law of the Jews did not allow them to travel. And truly he did not speak falsely in saying so, for the festival which we call Pentecost did then fall out to be the next day to the Sabbath, right? And that'll be, actually we got the day of Simon before we got the Pentecost, but it's 7 Sabbaths after the Passover, and then the following day after that 7th Sabbath is where you get the term Pentecost from. It means 50 days. All right. 7 weeks plus a day is 50 days. Nor is it lawful for us to journey either on a Sabbath day or on a festival day. But when Antiochus joined battle with Arsaces, the king of Parthia, he lost a great part of his army and was himself slain. And his brother Demetrius succeeded in the kingdom of Syria by the permission of Arsaces, who freed him from his captivity at the same time that Antiochus attacked Parthia, as we have formerly related elsewhere. So that's what ended up happening between that Antiochus that turned on Simon, but he ended up making peace with Hyrcanus, Simon's son, and Ptolemy was banished and never to be heard from again. All right. So, chapter 9. I do want to get into this just so that we can sort of bridge the gap, all right, and show a little bit of history here, all right? So chapter 9, how after the death of Antiochus, Hyrcanus made an expedition against Syria and made a league with the Romans concerning the death of King Demetrius and Alexander. But when Hyrcanus heard of the death of Antiochus, he presently made an expedition against the cities of Syria, hoping to find them destitute of fighting men, and of such as were able to defend them. However, it was not till the 6th month that he took Medaba, and that not without the greatest distress of his army. After this, he took Samega and the neighboring places, and besides these, Shechem and Gerizim and the nation of the Kuthians, right? So Hyrcanus is doing the same thing that Simon and them did, except he's going a bit further, right? Not only is he recovering cities of Israel, but he's going further, and he's taking the other lands that are around about Israel as well, all right? Who dwelt at the temple, which resembled that temple which was at Jerusalem, and which Alexander permitted Sanballat, the general of his army, to build for the sake of Manasseh, who was son-in-law to Jaddua the high priest, as we have formerly related, which temple was now deserted 200 years after it was built. Hyrcanus took also Dora and Marissa, cities of Idumea, and subdued all the Idumeans. So keep that in mind. Hyrcanus subdued all the Idumeans. And listen what he did here, all right? And permitted them to stay in that country if they would circumcise their genitals and make use of the laws of the Jews, right? So Hyrcanus enforced the laws of God upon the Edomites, upon the Idumeans, all right? Idumeans is just a Greek and Roman word for Edom, all right? And they were so desirous of living in the country of their forefathers that they submitted to the use of circumcision. You see that right there? So the Idumeans, the Edomites, became hold on, excuse me. Let me finish this out. And the rest of the Jewish ways of living, at which time therefore this befell them, that they were here no after no other than Jews. You see that right there? So he's saying, look, there were Idumeans, there were Edomites at this time who became Jews, who became Jewish. All right. So I'm going to read this because you got a little A right here. As you can see right here, you got a little A. That means there's something down here at the bottom that Whiston wants to make clear. All right, so this account of the Idumeans admitting circumcision and the entire Jewish law from this time, or from the days of Hyrcanus, is confirmed by their entire history afterwards. So he's referencing other Josephus books right here. This, in the opinion of Josephus, made them proselytes of justice, or entire Jews, as here and elsewhere. He mentions them, as I said right there. He said, look, we made them Jews, right? However, Antigonus, the enemy of Herod, though Herod were derived from such a proselyte of justice for several generations, will allow him to be no more than a half Jew. All right. So he said, look, this is where Herod comes from. These Idumeans who were forced to convert to being Jews, all right, who became Jewish. But Antigonus, who is actually a descendant of the Hasmoneans, he said, look, y'all ain't Jews. Y'all might be half a Jew, but y'all ain't Jews. He said, look, y'all Jewish, in other words, all right? But still take out of Dean Prideaux at the year 129 the words of Ammonius, a grammarian, which fully confirm this account of the Idumeans, all right? So, I'm not going to read all of this. We're actually going to skip over to the next page because it finishes a little bit over here. So we're not going to save this. We're going to go to page 353 and we're going to read the rest of this appendix that's over here on this side. All right. Here we go. It says, but then, upon what foundation so good a governor as Hyrcanus took upon him to compel those Idumeans either to become Jews or to leave the country deserves great consideration. I suppose it was because they had long ago been driven out of the land of Edom and had seized on and possessed the tribe of Simeon and all the southern part of the tribe of Judah, which was the peculiar inheritance of the worshippers of the true God without idolatry, as the reader may learn from Rayland Palestine. He starts to reference some other books. But the point is, Hyrcanus saw that the Edomites were living in what was technically Israelite lands, in the lands of Simeon and the southern part of Judah. So he said, look, if y'all gonna live in our land, you're gonna have to do what the word of God says to do. All right, y'all gonna have to get circumcised, you're gonna have to keep all the laws. And that's when Edomites, and particularly the family of Herod, were forced to become Jewish. All right, and I'm not gonna read this whole letter right here, but I do want to start right here where it says, but Hyrcanus the high priest was desirous to renew the league of friendship they had with the Romans. All right, so keep that in mind. Let me make this a little bigger. That's all right. That's all right. So yeah, Hyrcanus confirmed the league that the Jews had with the Romans. All right. So I'm not going to read this whole letter because the Romans wrote back with a good letter, with a good long letter saying, hey, look, it's all good. Or it says, this is the end of the letter. It says, it was therefore decreed as to these points to renew their league of friendship and mutual assistance with these good men and who were sent by a good and friendly people. You see that right there? So that confirmed the letters. All right. So we're going to leave it there with the book of Josephus. But understand, after Hyrcanus, he was the last one of the Hasmonean family that was righteous, because he had two sons, or his two eldest sons rather, Aristobulus and Antigonus. All right, they were wicked as hell, and they were originally in league together, originally on the same side, but then Aristobulus ended up killing Antigonus, and then he shortly died after that as well. So then his third oldest son, Hyrcanus's third oldest son, Alexander, took the high priesthood. And you can see that represented here. Now, let me go ahead and open this up. Let's open in a new window. You can see that represented here. And let me just pull this up and let me show you this real quick. Okay, so you see the KJV genealogies. I got a folder on here called the KJV genealogies. Now, this you won't even find in a 1611 edition. For some reason, they leave these out of the 1611 edition. These you can only find in the 400th anniversary edition of the 1611 edition KJVs. All right. The 400th anniversary edition was obviously printed in 2011. To find these before that, you'd have to like get one of the originals that were sent out from the print press in 1611. But they're all online now. I got these all offline. And these are the genealogies that are in the beginning of the original 1611 editions. Or not even the 1611 editions, excuse me. The original King James Version that were made in 1611. You can only find these genealogies in the 400th anniversary edition, all right, of the KJVs. All right. Now, with all that being said, these KJVs are not the same as the Word of God. These were established by the translators, all right? I will say that they were good at understanding the Chronicles, the books of the Chronicles, and chronicling the things that were in the Scriptures. They were good at that. They weren't perfect, but they were good at that, all right? The same way whenever you have a 1611 KJV, you will see mistakes where, like, it'll be verse 6, but it's actually verse 5 or things like that. But they record the high priest. I know y'all can see this over here on the left side. It says, I'll actually zoom in a little bit and just move this over. Maybe y'all be able to see that. Actually, I don't know. Let me zoom out. It says the Maccabees unto Herod the Great. All right, so it lists them, and it has Judas Maccabeus here, but he was never the high priest. But you do have other priests, and you do have, but all these are high priests, though. Not necessarily. Some of these are just, of the lineage of the priesthood. But it does list all the high priests here. I will say that. Some of these are just priests, but not high priests. All right. But as you see here, Judas Maccabeus is listed. Jonathan was his brother, and Jonathan was actually established as the high priest. All right. Simon, his brother, took over after him. Then you had Johannes. This is John that's mentioned in 1 Maccabees 16. This is John Hyrcanus. All right, this is Johannes here, the son of Simon. Then it goes to John's son, Aristobulus. All right, and Aristobulus was not righteous. He killed his brother Antigonus. All right, and then Aristobulus shortly died after that. And then Alexander, his younger brother, the third oldest son of Hyrcanus, took over after Aristobulus. All right. So that's what you see here. And then we'll get into Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II a little later. We'll loop back to these two. All right. Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. We'll loop back to them. But now I want to go all the way back. We'll leave this here because we'll touch on that again. We can exit out of that, though. Now I want to go all the way back, all right? I want to go all the way back to the origins of Rome, all right? And we probably going to be here a while. I am going to jump around. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but this is the book that I'm going to be reading out of now because we're done with Josephus, all right? We may reference it, but we're not going to go back to it, all right? This is The Story of Civilization. That's a series by Will Durant. This is called Caesar and Christ. All right. That's the book right here. That's what it looks like. I'll zoom in out a little bit more just so you can see the whole thing. That's what the book looks like. All right. Zoom in some and even to that much. All right. So we're going to jump to page 5. All right. We're going to jump around here. I'm not trying to keep you all night. This may go a little long, though. It may go over an hour. All right. So we're talking about the Etruscans. I don't know if I ever talked about how I know I've talked about it before, but I don't know if I talked about it on Bible History 101, where the original inhabitants of Greece were not the white folk that were the Greek Empire. All right. There were Japhet, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans were the original inhabitants of Greece. All right, all historians know this. All real historians know this. They know that the original inhabitants of Greece were not white people. We're about to actually read it here, but these are talking about the Etruscans, the original inhabitants of Italy. All right, were not white people. They were Japhethites. All right, and we're about to read about it here. All right, so I'm gonna start here on page 5. Yes, on page 5, talking about Etruscan life. The Etruscans are among the irritating obscurities of history. They ruled Rome for 100 years or more and left upon Roman ways so varied and influenced that Rome can hardly be understood without them. You see that right there? So they founded Rome. They founded Italy. Yet Roman literature is as mute concerning them as a matron anxious to forget. He said right there, they're anxious to forget because, you know, white people don't want to let you know about the dark races that preceded them. That's always been the case. All right. You'll open up a textbook in America and you see a white guy with a pharaoh's crown on, like, and talking about Egypt. You talking about Egypt and it's a white dude with a pharaoh's crown? No, that's obviously not the case. And it's the same with how Italy started as well. All right. Let's see. Publicly, the surrenders of her youth. Italian civilization as literate provision begins with them. So Italian civilization begins with the Etruscans. All right, that's who it began with, the Etruscans. All right. So like I said, we're gonna skip around. Consequently, men still debate who the Etruscans were and when and whence they came, when and where they come from. Perhaps the old tradition has been too readily set aside. Pedants love to disprove the accepted, which mischievously survives. Most Greek and Roman historians took it for granted that the Etruscans had come from Asia Minor. All right, so I got that underlined because Asia Minor is Turkey. All right, that's how the Japhethites got from Mount Ararat. Remember, that's where the Ark landed with Noah and his 3 sons. All right, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The Ark landed at Mount Ararat in Turkey. All right, that's what the scripture said. It landed in Mount Ararat. All right, and so it only makes sense that Japhethites got to the European islands and the European continent through Turkey. All right. The Etruscans had come from Asia Minor. Many elements in their religion, dress, and art suggest an Asiatic origin. Many again seem natively Italian. Most likely the civilization of Etruria, right, that's the Etruscan civilization, was an outgrowth of the Villanovan culture, commercially influenced by the Greece and Near East, while the Etruscans themselves, as they believed, were invaders from Asia Minor, probably Lydia, right? So they weren't Lydian, but they did come by way of Turkey. All right, they went to the islands of Achaia, which is Greece, the Mediterranean islands right there next to Turkey originally, and then they made their way west. All right. So and again, he's writing this, Will Durant, and don't take everything that's written in the book as, you know, gospel, because obviously it's not the scriptures, but the historians know this. That's all I'm trying to prove. That the historians know this. All right, they know this stuff. All right. So page 6, and again, I'm jumping around because I don't want to read this whole book. It's 500 something pages, maybe even 600 pages. I'm not going to read this whole book, but I'm gonna jump down where it says right here, the people themselves, starting right here. The people themselves are pictured on their tombs as short and stocky with large heads, features almost Anatolian, they almost look Turkish, complexion ruddy. All right, so ruddy, and I've been through this before when talking about David, when it said David was ruddy. All right, ruddy is not quite black, not quite white. That's what ruddy means. All right, ruddy brown, that's what it means. All right, when the scriptures say David was ruddy, even light-skinned. In the scriptures, that's what David looked like. He was light-skinned, all right? He wasn't black, but he wasn't white. He was ruddy, all right? That's the middle ground. It means brown, ruddy brown, all right? Especially in women. But rouge is as old as civilization, right? You know how women put red makeup on their face, all right? I'm just going... Well, I guess I can read through this. The ladies were famous for their beauty, and the men sometimes had faces of refinement and nobility. Civilization had already advanced to a precarious height, for specimens of dental bridgework had been found in the graves. Dentistry, like medicine and surgery, had been imported from Egypt and Greece. Both sexes wore the hair long, and the men fondled beards. Garments followed the Ionian style, and an inner shirt like the chiton, and an outer robe that became the Roman toga, right? So what we know as Greek and Roman fashion came from the Japhethites, all right? Oh yeah, it says men as well as women loved ornament, and their tombs abounded in jewelry, all right? So we'll keep on going with this. We're gonna skip to page 11. I'm pretty sure this starts talking about like their Their rise and downfall in Rome. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so in 618 BC, according to the precise and precarious tradition, an Etruscan adventurer captured the throne of Rome. And for a century, the Roman nation was ruled and formed by Etruscan civilization and power. All right, so Rome was formed, meaning founded, and ruled by the Etruscans, all right, who founded like all of Italy. All of the Mediterranean area were founded by Japhethites, all at least European way. All right, it was all founded by Japhethites. All right. What happened was the Japhethites came in first, then the Israelite Phoenician connection started taking over in the European area, So we'll get to that in the next one, I think. All right. So page 14. If not, I'll just go ahead and say it if it's not on this page. Let's see. Might be on the next page, but yeah, it was initially the Japhethites went and inhabited the European areas, and then it was the Israelite Phoenician connection who came through. I've talked about on this before. The Israelites and Phoenicians came, mostly Israelites, went and inhabited all the areas during the days of Solomon in 1000 BC, and after that as well. And then you had white people come later. All right, that's how Europe was inhabited. All right, about 655 BC precedes the tradition. Demaratus, a rich merchant banished from Corinth, came to live in Tarquini and married an Etruscan woman. His son Lucius Tarquinius migrated to Rome, rose to high position there, and on the death of Ancus, either seized the throne or more probably was chosen to it by a coalition of Etruscan families in the city. So, now in this 655 BC, this may be a Japhethite or it may be an Edomite that came from Greece who intermarried with the Etruscans and ended up, establishing some Etruscan kingdom with a monarch instead of how they had been doing it, which was, mainly just no government. He was the first, says Livy, who canvassed for the crown and delivered a set speech to secure the support of the plebs. The plebs, or as it says right here, those citizens who could not trace their ancestry to the founding fathers. You see that right there? So the plebs was, just everybody who was there that was not a Japhethite, essentially. All right. Under this, Tarquinius, Priscus, the monarchy increased its power over the aristocracy. The Etruscan influence grew in Roman politics, engineering, religion, and art. Tarquin fought successfully against the Sabines and subjugated all Latium, right? So he took over all of Italy, all right? He used the resources of Rome, we are told, to adorn Tarquini and other Etruscan cities. But also he brought Etruscan and Greek artists to his capital and beautified it with majestic temples. You see that right there? So he brought the culture of Rome, essentially. This Tarquin guy, he started initially with he brought the Etruscan culture up, essentially. All right. Apparently, he represented the growing power of business and finance against the landed aristocracy. After a reign of 38 years, the first Tarquin was assassinated by the patricians, who aimed to limit the kingship again to a religious role, right? So the rich in the area said, look, we don't want you to actually have power. We want you to be a puppet. All right. But Tarquin's widow, Tanaquil, took charge of the situation and was able to transmit the throne to her son Servius Tullius. Servius says Cicero was the first to hold the royal power without being chosen by the people. You see that right there. So Servius, we'll see what happens with Servius. All right, i.e. by the leading families. He governed well and built a protective moat and wall around Rome, but the great landowners resented his rule and plotted to unseat him. Consequently, he allied himself with the richer members of the plebs and reorganized the army and voters to strengthen his position. All right, so that's what you call gerrymandering today, right? Drawing up certain districts and things like that. All right, using the rich to get an advantage over the people. Taking a census of persons and property, he classified the citizens according to wealth rather than birth. so that while leaving the old aristocracy intact, he raised up as a balance to it a class of equites, literally horsemen, men who could equip themselves with a horse, right? So he established a military that would keep him in power, all right, and armor to serve in the cavalry. The census reported some 80,000 persons capable of bearing arms, reckoning one woman and one child for each soldier and a slave for every fourth family. We may estimate around 250,000 people of Rome and its subject environs about 560 BC. Servius divided the people into 35 new tribes, arranging them according to a place of residence rather than kinship or rank. Thereby, like Cleisthenes a generation later in Attica, he weakened the political cohesion and voting power of the aristocracy, right? So because the rich didn't want him in power, he said, well, I'm going to take power away from the rich, all right? The class that rated itself supreme by birth. When another Tarquin, grandson of Tarquinius Priscus, charged Servius with ruling illegally, he submitted himself to a plebiscite and received, says Livy, a unanimous vote. So the people didn't like Servius. The people did not like Servius at all. He was going against rather I should say the aristocracy basically did their propaganda to turn the people on Servius, all right? And, you know, maybe rightfully so. I mean, he did some good things for Rome, but, you know, they didn't like him. Probably because of how he was gerrymandering to keep himself in power. May have something to do with it. When another Tarquin, grandson of Tarquinius Priscus, so I just read that. Unconvinced, Tarquin had Servius assassinated and announced himself king. So that Tarquin right there, he said, look, I'm going to make myself king. Under Tarquinius Superbus, the proud, the monarchy became absolute and Etruscan influence supreme. All right, so I'm gonna skip down. It says, but this new Tarquin was worse than the first. You see that right there? So this is this Tarquin family is just messing everything up. All right, they're just ruining the city, and they're just trying to keep themselves in power. They're not trying to do it in righteousness, all right, or in any kind of nobility, really. He surrounded himself with a bodyguard, degraded freemen with months of forced labor, had citizens crucified in the forum, put to death many leaders of the upper classes, and ruled with an insolent brutality that won him the hatred of all influential men. You see that right there? Nobody liked this Tarquinius. Who is this one? Superbus. Nobody liked the Tarquinius Superbus. All right. Thinking to gain popularity by successful wars, he attacked the Rotuli and the Volscians. While he was with the army, the Senate assembled and deposed him in 508 BC, and one of the great turning points of Roman history. All right, so you see that right there. So this guy was so bad, they had to create a new form of government. All right, and that's where the Senate came from. All right, and this is the same Senate, or a similar Senate that's around in 1 Maccabees chapter 8 that we read about during the days of Judas when he heard about the Romans. And this was maybe 160s BC, 150s BC when this Senate was still around. It lasted for around 450 years, you know. This Senate lasts from 508 BC to basically 30 BC or thereabout. All right, we'll read a little bit more into that here in a minute. Not the Senate. I don't necessarily care about the Senate, but how it falls, how the Senate transitions to another form of government. All right, so that's it on that page. I will finish this out about the Etruscans right here on page 16, 17, 18. I don't want to read all this because all this that up here, it was just, some legend about how the Tarquinius, or rather the Tarquins were evil and doing wicked things. We don't necessarily want to read that. I'm just going to skip down to this right here. It said the revolution had two main results. The revolution of, around 500 BC. Had two main results. It freed Rome from Etruscan ascendancy and replaced the monarchy with an aristocracy that ruled Rome until Caesar. The political position of the poor citizens was not improved. You see that right there? So they didn't do that to improve the state of the poor, don't get me wrong. They did that so that the rich could be better off. They wouldn't have, some king telling them what to do. All right? On the contrary, they were required to surrender the lands that Servius had given them. And they lost the modest measure of protection with which with which the poor lost the protections with which the monarchy had shielded them from aristocratic domination, right? So the monarchy had actually helped the people a little bit, but not when the Senate came through. The Senate came through and destroyed that. All right. The victors called the revolution a triumph of liberty. But now and then, liberty in the slogans of the strong means freedom from restraint and the exploitation of the weak. Now, that's a quote right there. All right. And it's the same thing here in America. And that's what you're going to see as we read this. You're going to see the similarities between Rome and America. All right. The Senate say, or even the Senate here in America, right? The government here in America says that we're free and we have liberty, but it means restraint. Or it means freedom from restraint in the exploitation of the weak. It means they can get away with whatever because there's nobody enforcing anything on them. All right. They're the ones sitting at the top. All right. The expulsion of the Tarquins from Rome added to the defeat of the Etruscans by Greek colonists in Cumae in 524. So that's when you start to see Edomites really get into Rome, was around 500 BC. All right. And just to give you the time frame, that's around the same time. I should say that 517 thereabout was when Cyrus made the decree that that Jews are to be free to go back to Jerusalem to build a temple. That's around, Ezra time, around the death of Daniel, around that same time. All right, is that Rome is being inhabited by the Edomites, and the Edomites are setting up that Senate. All right. So said Rome was weakened for a generation, but her revolution remained. So saying this new government was around for a while. It was around for, around 450 years, give or take. 450 to 500 years, give or take. The Etruscan power had been expelled, but the marks and relics of Etruscan influence were to survive in Roman civilization to its end. That influence was apparently least on the Latin language. And then it goes on to list examples. From the 7th to the 4th centuries BC, it was a custom among Roman aristocrats to send their sons to Etruscan cities for higher education. All right. So from the 600s to the 300s, the Romans were still learning from the Japhethites. All right. So it says there among other, this page 18. I'm just going into, Etruscan influence on Rome at this point. And then we'll get into Caesar and them. All right. Other things they learned: geometry, surveying, and architecture. Roman dress derived from the Etruscan, or both from the common source. Etruscan engineers built the walls and sewers of Rome and turned it from a swamp into a protected and civilized capital. Right. So they built Rome. The Japhethites are the ones who built Rome. All right. So Rome took her musical modes and instruments from Etruria. Most of her artists were Etruscans. The arts themselves may have filtered in through Latium from the companion Greeks, right? So a lot of art, whatever culture that Rome did not get from the Japhethites, they ended up getting from the Greeks, who, the Greeks got all their stuff from the Japhethites as well, all right? It says Etruscan architects bequeathed to Rome a Tuscan style. So the Tuscan style came from, Etruscan architects. It says not till Caesar would Rome see again so much building as under Etruscan rule. Right. So the Etruscans were so influential that it wasn't until Caesar and in that age that Rome started taking over the world that the culture didn't really change. Until Caesar and them. All right. So it said, we must not exaggerate. However much Rome learned from her neighbors, she remained in all the basic features of life distinctly herself. Right. So it was still unique. And obviously, Will Durant's not going to sit here and say they got everything from Japhet, but just about. So now we're going to get into Caesar. All right. And I'm not even getting into like anything that Caesar did before, everything started to fall apart in Rome. All right. Now, keep in mind, this Will Durant, he's really big on Caesar. All right. So understand that it's in a very positive light that he talks about Caesar. But we're gonna try to dissect this and see what am I looking for? What's in between the lines? Excuse me. During the second quinquennium of Caesar in Gaul, Roman politics had become an unparalleled chaos of corruption and violence. Sound familiar? A corrupt government that is violent? You may say, well, politics ain't that violent now. Look back at the 60s. They killed a president in the 60s. All right? That was the last one that didn't do what they wanted. All right? They killed him and then said it was Lee Harvey Oswald, and all of a sudden Lee Harvey Oswald died as well before he could go to trial. Then all of a sudden the guy who killed Lee Harvey Oswald died as well. Jack Ruby died as well before he could go to trial. It's just so shady, you know what I'm saying? And every civil rights leader who stood up against him died corrupt and violent. All right, that's how Rome was. All right, in its last days, or in the degradation of its democracy, when the fall of the Senate and them. All right, it said Pompey and Crassus, as consuls, pursued their policies by the bribery of votes, the intimidation of juries, and occasional murder. Right? That's what we see these days. Occasional murder. When their year of office ended, Crassus recruited and conscripted a large army and sailed for Syria. He crossed the Euphrates and met the Parthians at Carrhae. Their superior cavalry defeated him, and his son fell into battle. Crassus was withdrawing his forces in good order when the Parthian general invited him to a conference. He went and was treacherously slain. His head was sent to play the part of Pentheus in a performance of Euripides' Bacchae and the Parthian, at the Parthian, what are we looking at right here? At the Parthian, and he said they cut his head off and put in a play at the Parthian court. His leaderless army, long wearied of the campaign, disappeared in a disorderly rout. So that was Crassus rather. Meanwhile, Pompey, too, had levied an army, and presumably to complete the conquest of Spain. You see that right there? So Crassus just died. All right. Now we see Pompey. This man named Pompey, he's a general. All right. He's thinking about going to conquer Spain. Had Caesar's plans matured, so Caesar, he was also a general at that time, or he was rather the governor of, I think he was the governor of Gaul at that time. Had Caesar's plans matured, Pompey would have brought farther Spain and Crassus, Armenia and Parthia within the orbit of Roman power at the same time that Caesar was extending the frontier to the Tyne and the Rhine. So that would be Britain and Germany, right? So that's what Caesar wanted. Caesar wanted to take over the whole world. All right, that's what Julius Caesar wanted, to take over the whole world. All right, it didn't come to fruition, but they still got the Mediterranean area. Instead of leading his legions to Spain, Pompey kept them in Italy, except for one which he lent to Caesar in the crisis of the Gallic revolt in 54 BC. The strongest tie that held him to Caesar was cut by the death of his wife Julia in childbirth. Caesar offered him his grandniece Octavia, now Caesar's nearest female relative, and asked for the hand of Pompey's daughter, right? But Pompey refused both proposals, right? So Caesar, he wanted to establish an alliance with Pompey. All right. He said, look, we link up together and we'll take over the whole world. Right. But Pompey was like, nah, I want it all for myself. The debacle of Crassus and his army in the following year removed another balancing force, for a victorious Crassus would have opposed the dictatorship of either Caesar or Pompey. Right. So Crassus wouldn't have had the dictatorship of either. All right. But that's where it's headed. The dictatorship of one or the other. Caesar wanted it to be both. He said, look, we can both take over this thing. Pompey's like, nah, I just want it to be me. All right. Henceforth, Pompey openly allied himself with the conservatives. His plan to secure supreme power through legal forms had now only one obstacle: the ambition and army of Caesar. Right? So Pompey wanted to do it all legally. He said, look, I'm going to take over the world, and Rome specifically, legally. All right? Knowing that Caesar's command would expire in 49 BC, Pompey secured decrees continuing his own command to the end of 46. And requiring all Italians capable of bearing arms to take an oath of military fealty to him personally. In this way, he trusted time itself would make him master of Rome. While the potential dictators maneuvered for position, the capital filled with the odor of a dying democracy. All right, so everybody can see the writing on the wall. It's all over. The age of the Senate is dying, and Somebody's gonna fill in those dictator shoes. All right. Verdicts, offices, provinces, and client kings were sold to the highest bidders. In the year 53, the first voting division in the assembly was paid 10 million sesterces for its vote. When money failed, murder was available. You see that right there? So if they couldn't buy you off, they'd kill you off. All right? That's what happened. That's what happened with Rome. All right? Sound familiar? Or a man's past was raked over and blackmail brought him to terms. Sound familiar? All right. We've talked about it on here before. Gad specifically talked about it on here before. One nation under blackmail. All right. That's how America runs. When money failed, murder was available, or blackmail brought you to terms. That's exactly what's happening. All right. What's happening today? Crime flourished in the city. Sound familiar? Brigandage in the country. No police force existed to control it. Rich men hired bands of gladiators to protect them, and that's what the police do here in America. They serve capital. They serve the rich. That's why the rich can just, either bribe a judge or get the highest lawyer, or get the best lawyer, rather, the highest price lawyer, to come and, smooth things over for anything that gets them in trouble. All right? Or to support them in the commission. The lowest elements in Italy were attracted to Rome by the smell of money or the gift of corn. You see that right there? Sound familiar? People come to America to make money. Or they hear that there's food everywhere. And there is. You can go to the grocery store and buy food. A lot of countries you can't just go to the grocery store to buy food. Imagine that. If you got an American mindset, you think that, you can just go to any country and just go to the grocery store. Nah, that's not how it works in a lot of places. All right. And made the meetings of the assembly a desecration. Any man who would vote as paid was admitted to the rolls, whether citizen or not. Sound familiar? People talking about voter fraud all the time now. Whether it's true or not, people are still talking about it. All right. Sometimes only a minority of those who cast ballots were entitled to vote. That's what they say. That's what they say. That there's so many illegal voters. That's what they're saying. Whether it's true or not, that's what they say. The privilege of addressing the assembly had on several occasions to be won by storming the rostrum and holding it by main force. Legislation came to be determined by the fluctuating superiority of rival gangs. Those who voted the wrong way were now and then beaten to within an inch of their lives, after which their houses were set afire. Following one such meeting, Cicero wrote, the Tiber was full of corpses of citizens. The public sewers were stuffed with them, and slaves had to mop up with sponges the blood that streamed from the forum. Now, that's a bit more violent than what we see today, but hey, it's, there are certainly similarities between when Rome's democracy started to fall and with what's happening in the U.S. All right, and in other places. It's not just the U.S. But any time, and we're going to read that later, where the route that democracy always goes down. All right. So it says, Clodius and Milo were Rome's most distinguished experts in this brand of parliament. They organized rival bands of ruffians for political purposes. And hardly a day passed without some test of their strength. One day, Clodius assaulted Cicero on the street. Another day, his warriors burned down Milo's house. At last, Clodius himself was caught by Milo's gang and killed. That was in 52 BC. The proletariat, meaning, general workers, your average person, not privy to all his plots, honored Clodius as a martyr, gave him a mighty funeral, carried the body to the Senate house, and burned the building over him as a funeral pyre. You see that right there? So the people were so fed up with the injustice that was happening in Rome that when Clodius died, they said, we're going to use this man as an example. All right. They knew that he wasn't the most righteous man who ever existed. All right. But they said, look, there's some injustice going on. This man is what we're going to use as an example. They took him to the Senate and they burned down the Senate. Pompey brought in his soldiers and dispersed the mob. As reward, he asked from the Senate and received appointment as consul without colleague, a phrase that Cato recommended as more pleasant than dictator. All right. So Pompey essentially became the dictator of Rome in 52 BC. All right. Essentially. All right. You still had his dissenters, and we're about to read about this in the Civil War down here. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and skip to this down here, because what's about to break out is Caesar. He wants the rulership. He wants to be the dictator. He doesn't want Pompey to be the dictator. Caesar wants to be the dictator. So that's what we're about to see right here. A century of revolution had broken down a selfish and narrow aristocracy, but had put no other government in its place. You see that right there? So the people were revolting, but they didn't have any plans afterward. All right? It's like when people go on these violent protests, and they start burning down their grocery store, their their own community, right? And then they don't have no plans to rebuild. They don't know what they're going to do instead, right? It says unemployment, bribery, bread, and circuses had corrupted the assembly into an ill-informed and passion-ridden mob, obviously incapable of ruling itself, much less an empire. Democracy had fallen by Plato's formula. Liberty had become license, and chaos begged an end to liberty. Right? So it says Caesar agreed with Pompey that the republic was dead. It was now, he said, a mere name without body or form. Dictatorship was unavoidable. You see that right there? So that's how they looked at it. That's how Caesar and Pompey looked at it. Dictatorship is what has to happen now. That's how they looked at it. But he had hoped to establish a leadership that would be progressive, that would not freeze the status quo, but would lessen the abuses, inequities, and destitution which had degraded democracy. Like I said, this Will Durant, he really loves Caesar, and Caesar was like, "Hey, I'll rule right. I'll be a good dictator, though." That's what he said. He's like, look, dictatorship, that's unavoidable, but I'll be a good dictator, though. That's essentially what he's saying here. All right. He was now 54, so Caesar was 54 years old, and surely weakened by his long campaigns in Gaul, he did not relish a war against his fellow citizens. All right, so, page 181, and he did not want to go to war against his fellow citizens, and let's see what this says. And his former friends. All right, so he didn't want to go to war with the Romans. He just wanted to go conquer the rest of the world, right? But Gaul is like around the Alps. So you have like the French side of the Alps, you have the Italian side of the Alps these days, and you also have the, I guess you have like the Swiss side of the Alps, like all that's Gaul. All right. His former friends, I see. He didn't want to go to war with his former friends, but he saw the snares that had been prepared for him and resented them as an ill reward for one who had saved Italy, right? So he's like, I'm the one who saved Italy. Why are they coming against me, right? His term as governor of Gaul would end on March the 1st in 49 BC. He could not run for the consulship until the fall of that year. In the interval, he would lose the immunity of an office holder and could not enter Rome without subjecting himself to those proscriptions which were among the favorite weapons of party warfare in Rome. So if he would have went to Rome, as governor of Gaul, he could not be arrested for his crimes, or at least he could not be arrested by the opposing party, right? By Pompey, right? Whether he was innocent or not, he could not be arrested as governor. But as soon as that governorship ended, he would be arrested, and it was the writing on the wall. They could see it, or rather, he could see it. That as soon as if he tried to enter Rome, he would be arrested by Pompey. All right, after that March the 1st. Already Marcus Marcellus had proposed to the Senate that Caesar should be deposed from his governorship before his expiration, which meant self-exile or trial. So he already, what's the word I'm looking for? He was already impeached. So he knew that if he was not in a government position, was not the governor of Gaul, they would try to arrest him if he went to Rome. All right. The tribunes of the plebs had saved him by their veto, but the Senate clearly favored the motion. All right. So the Senate wanted to arrest him. All right. The Senate did not like Caesar. They did not like Julius Caesar. Cato frankly expressed the hope that Caesar would be accused, tried, and banished from Italy. So plenty of people did not like Caesar. All right. So I'm gonna skip down through his supporters in the Senate, because obviously there's a couple hundred people in the Senate. I think it's like 320 people in the Senate. Through his supporters in the Senate, Caesar requested a renewal of the assembly's earlier decree permitting him to stand for the consulship in absence. The Senate refused to submit the motion and demanded that Caesar dismiss his troops. Caesar felt that his legions were his only protection. He said, look, the only thing that's keeping Rome from coming to arrest me is the fact that I have the army on my side. All right. Caesar felt that his legions were his only protection. Perhaps he had nourished their personal loyalty with a view to just such a crisis as this. Nevertheless, he proposed to the Senate that both he and Pompey should lay down their commissions. He said, look, if I'm going down, Pompey's going down with me. All right. if I'm going to give up my rulership, he's got to give up his rulership too. All right. An offer which seemed to the people of Rome so reasonable that they garlanded his messenger with flowers. The people of Rome were like, yeah, that makes sense. We don't want Pompey as a dictator if we can't have Caesar as a dictator, right? The Senate favored the plan, 370 to 22. So even the Senate was like, yeah, it makes sense. I mean, we don't want either of you as dictators. But Pompey balked at it. Pompey was like, nah, I ain't doing that. In the last days of the year 50, the Senate declared Caesar a public enemy unless he should abandon his command by July the 1st. On the first day of 49 BC, Curio read to the Senate a letter in which Caesar agreed to disband all but 2 of his 10 legions if he might retain the governorship till 48 BC. But he spoiled the offer by adding that he would look upon its rejection as a declaration of war. You see that right there? So he said, look, I'll make a proposal, and if you don't agree to this, then we're going to have a civil war. We're going to war. All right. Cicero spoke for the proposal, and Pompey agreed to it. But the consul Lentulus intervened and drove Caesar's lieutenants, Curio and Antony, from the Senate house. After a long debate, the reluctant Senate, persuaded by Lentulus, Cato, and Marcellus, gave Pompey orders and powers to see that no harm should come to the state, which is the Roman phrase for dictatorship and martial law. So the opposers of Caesar said they rather convinced the Senate to declare war on Julius Caesar and declare martial law on Rome. All right. Caesar hesitated more than was wont. Legally, the Senate was right. He had no authority to name the conditions under which he would resign his command. You see that right there? So he wasn't legally in the right. This was illegal for him to call off or to rather declare a civil war if they don't agree to his demands. He's just the governor of a province. All right. He knew that civil war might bring Gaul to revolt. All right. And Italy might bring Gaul to revolt and Italy to ruin. But to yield was to surrender the empire to incompetence and reaction. He said, they don't know how to run the country. I know how to run the country. All right. Does it sound familiar? There's this ego-driven maniac who would rather start a civil war than not have power. All right. But that's how he sees it. That's how he sees it. I'm the only one that can run the country. All right. So I'll skip a sentence. He summoned the soldiers of his favorite 13th Legion and laid the situation before them. His first word won them. Commilitones, which is fellow soldiers, right? He was a man of the people. Caesar knew how to speak to the people, knew how to get the people on his side, knew how to rally the people, especially soldiers. All right, they who had seen him shared their hardships and perils because he was out there fighting with them. He didn't send them to war. He went to war with them. He led them to war. Who had to complain that he risked himself too readily, recognized his right to use this word. He had always addressed them so rather than with the curt milites of less gracious commanders. So milites probably means like servants or, inferiors or whatever the case may be. Most of his men came from Cisalpine Gaul. So Cisalpine Gaul, I got it written down right here. I looked it up. Cisalpine Gaul is this side of the Alps, meaning from Rome's perspective, the closer side of the Alps, which is northern Italy. All right. That's what Cisalpine Gaul is, northern Italy. All right. Just south of the Alps, so you can understand. All right. It said most of the men came from Cisalpine Gaul, to which he had extended Roman citizenship. So Julius Caesar said, "Look, y'all are Roman citizens in my book." They knew that the Senate had refused to recognize this grant, and that one senator had flogged a Cisalpine Gaul just to show his contempt for Caesar's enfranchisement. It was illegal to flog a Roman citizen, so the Senate did not recognize them as citizens. But to Julius Caesar, he said, "Look, you're my men. You've been fighting alongside me. You're citizens in my book." All right. They had learned to respect Caesar, even in their rough, mute way, to love him during their many campaigns, right? They loved Caesar because he was out there with them. He knew how to talk to him. He knew how to treat him right. He had been severe with cowardice and indiscipline. So there's some things that he would not put up with, like, cowardice and getting out of line. But he had been lenient with their human faults, had winked at their sexual escapades, had spared them unnecessary dangers, had saved them by skillful generalship, had doubled their pay, and had spread his spoils among them handsomely. You see that right there? So he knew how to treat his military men. All right. He told them of his proposals to the Senate and how these had been received. He reminded them that an idle and corrupt aristocracy was unfit to give Rome order, justice, and prosperity. He said, "Look, the government is corrupt. I'm the one that's going to fix it." Would they follow him? Not one refused. When he told them that he had no money with which to pay them, they emptied their savings into his treasury. He said, "Look, I can't pay you any money." They said, "You know what? We'll pay you." All right. So yeah, I'm not going to get into the whole war. But understand, on January 10th of the year 49, that's when the war officially started, in the year 49 BC. That's when the Civil War started. So we're going to skip a few pages to like when it ends, because I'm already well over time, and trying to, keep this as brief as possible. All right, so I'm going to jump down to 185, page 185 here in the book, Caesar and Christ. And I'm going to start with the last paragraph where it says, "At Pharsalus, August 9th of the year 48 BC, the decisive battle was fought to the bitter end. Pompey had 48,000 in the infantry and 7,000 horsemen. Caesar had 22,000 in the infantry and 1,000 horsemen." All right. So I'm going to skip to the next page on page 186. So Pompey's army is greater than Julius Caesar's, all right, as in there's more men. There's more men in Pompey's army than in Julius Caesar's. It says the Pompeians were overwhelmed by superior leadership, training, and morale. 15,000 of them were killed or wounded. 20,000 surrendered, and the remainder fled. So 35,000 of 35,000 of Pompey's men were either killed or wounded. All right. Or rather, were either killed, wounded, or surrendered. All right, so then the rest just fled. All right, the other 13,000 just left Pompey, left the General Pompey. General Pompey tore the insignia of command from his clothing and took flight like the rest. So he runs scared, just like the rest of them, just like his men. Caesar tells us that he lost but 200 men, which casts doubt upon all his books, right? But the point is, even if Caesar's lying about, we only lost 200 men, even if he's lying about that, the point is they didn't lose much. All right, they whooped Pompey's tail. All right. His army was amused to see the tents of the defeated so elegantly adorned, and their tables laden with the feast that was to celebrate their victory. Right, so they left the stove on, essentially. You know what I'm saying? They had food ready. They thought they was about to smash Caesar and his men. Nah, Caesar and his men came ready to fight. All right, Caesar ate Pompey's supper in Pompey's tent. All right, so he took over. That's when he took over. Now, I believe this is in 48. This is like towards the end of the year 48 BC, or rather towards the fall of the year 48 BC. So I just want to read about the death of Pompey. But when Pompey reached Alexandria, so he fled to Egypt, Pothinus, eunuch vizier of young Ptolemy the 12th, ordered his servants to kill Pompey, presumably in expectation of reward from Caesar. The general was stabbed to death as he stepped on the shore. Right, so if I would have read the rest of this, it would have showed you that Caesar was actually pretty merciful to all the Romans who were fighting to Pompey or fighting for Pompey. He didn't, he wasn't bloodthirsty towards Romans. All right, he wanted to preserve them because he was tired of he was already kind of tired of fighting the Gauls. He didn't want to get in this war in the first place. Remember, he tried to establish a co-dictatorship with Pompey. Pompey is the one who refused. All right, so you have Hyrcanus, who ended up killing Pompey, stabbed to death on the shore, while his wife looked on in a helpless terror from the ship in which they had come. When Caesar arrived, Hyrcanus's men presented him with the severed head. Caesar turned away in horror and wept at this new proof that by diverse means men come to the same end. Right? So, and then said he established his quarters in the royal palace of the Ptolemies and set himself to regulate the affairs of the ancient kingdom. Right? So that's where Caesar took up shop. He initially started ruling from Egypt, and then he went to Rome and started ruling from Rome. But let's go ahead and talk about how, this is page 187. No, I ain't looking into that. On page 531, because I have it written down here at the bottom of what ended up happening with Caesar and them. I didn't want to read through the whole book because I knew that it was going to be a lot. But let me zoom out a little bit. It said Julius died in 44 BC. I'm reading from the bottom right here, this note that I took. Julius Caesar died in 44 BC. That's when he was betrayed by Antony and Brutus primarily. There was some others involved. But Antony, the general of Pompey, never forgave Caesar, I guess, and never accepted his rulership. So it was like 3.5 years later, after all that we was just reading, that Julius Caesar ended up dying in Rome. All right. And then Antony, from there, you had a struggle for the kingdom, struggle for the dictatorship, struggle for the rulership of Rome between a man named Octavian, who later changed his name to Augustus, Caesar Augustus. All right. And that's the Caesar who was ruling during Christ's birth. All right. So you had a struggle between Antony and Augustus between the years of 44 BC and around 30 BC. And that's when Antony died. He died in Egypt with Cleopatra, his lover. All right. I don't know if they ever got married, but he died in the arms of Cleopatra, all right, in Egypt. And Cleopatra ended up killing herself after that as well. So that was in 30 BC, and then Augustus established himself in Egypt for a year or so maybe, and then went to Rome and established the Roman Caesar as we become to know the Roman Empire and basically declared himself emperor in 27 BC. That's when he started his rulership. All right. But there's still something I want to touch on here because we haven't really connected the dots, right? So I want to connect the dots of the Hasmonean family, the Maccabean family, and what we just read about Rome coming into power. All right. And keep in mind, I know it's been a lot. We've been going for an hour and a half now, just about, but we're about to wrap it up. All right. So, this is talking about the Hasmoneans. This is in the same book, but it's on page 530 in the same book. It says, in 143 BC, Simon Maccabee, also known as Simon Thassi, taking advantage of the struggles among the Parthians, Seleucid, Egyptians, and Romans, wrest the independence of Judea from the Seleucid king. A popular assembly named him general and high priest of the second Jewish Commonwealth, and then it lists the dates of the second Jewish Commonwealth, and made the latter office hereditary in his Hasmonean family. Judea became again a theocracy under the Hasmonean dynasty of priest kings. Now, I got a question here. I got a question mark next to priest kings because how Simon had established it was, exactly how Moses wrote it, which is, the high priest is a religious office and then the Lord is the king. All right. And that's what it's about to say right here. It has been a characteristic of Semitic societies that they closely associated the spiritual and temporal powers in the family and in the state. They would have no sovereign but God. You see that right there? So the Lord is the king. Simon just established himself as the high priest because there was no righteous high priest in those days. And honestly, it wasn't even Simon. It was Jonathan. Jonathan was established as the high priest because the people wanted him to be the high priest. All right. And we read about that in Maccabees when we talked about Jonathan. All right. Recognizing the weakness of the little kingdom, the Hasmoneans spent 2 generations widening its borders by diplomacy and force. And see, that's what we read about in chapter 9 of that Josephus, all right, where it in book 13 of Josephus, where it talked about how Hyrcanus went around and proselytized and took over, I think it was Syria it mentioned, but then also Idumea, right? And it's about to mention all these places that Hyrcanus started, but then his son also continued, all right? They said 2 generations. By 78 BC, they had conquered and absorbed Samaria, Edom, Moab, Galilee, Idumea. Idumea is the same as Edom. Transjordania, Gadara, Pella, Gerasa, Raphia, and Gaza, and had made Palestine as extensive as under Solomon. So there was wide-reaching, all right? Very wide-reaching. The descendants of those brave Maccabees who had fought for religious freedom enforced Judaism and circumcision upon the new subjects at the point of the sword. Did we not read that? All right. And Josephus, he said the same thing. And it's important when you're reading books that are outside the Bible, it's important to cross-reference, all right, to understand that the history is legit. All right. At the same time, the Hasmoneans lost their religious zeal, and over the bitter protests of the Pharisees yielded more and more to the Hellenizing elements in the population. All right, and I ain't even get into how the Pharisees had a falling out with John Hyrcanus, and so John Hyrcanus aligned himself with the Sadducees. All right, but yeah, that's what ended up happening with those two. It's like rival camps. These days, it's like rival Israelite camps, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. All right. Queen Salome Alexandra. So Salome Alexandra was the wife of that wicked Aristobulus. All right, that we see right here, the son of John Hyrcanus. That's who that Salome Alexandra is, the wife of Aristobulus, and later the wife of Alexander. All right, because it was a law in Deuteronomy 25 that if your brother did not have seed, you had to marry his wife to raise up seed for your brother. That's what Alexander ended up doing. All right. It says, Queen Salome Alexandra reversed this trend and made peace with the Pharisees. But even before her death, her sons Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II began a war of succession. Both parties submitted their claims to Pompey, who now, so this is still when Pompey was alive in 63 BC. All right. These wicked Hyrcanus, this wicked Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. All right. They both want the preeminence. All right. They're not fighting for righteousness' sake. They're fighting for power. All right. Stood with his victorious legions at Damascus. When Pompey decided for Hyrcanus, Aristobulus fortified himself with his army in Jerusalem. He said, no, I want to be the high priest, right? I want to rule over the people, like that wicked Menelaus that we read about a few weeks ago, like that wicked Simon the Benjamite that we read about a few weeks ago, all right? In Jerusalem, Pompey laid siege to the capital and gained its lower sections. But the followers of Aristobulus took refuge in the walled precincts of the temple. So they went in the temple and was hiding from Pompey, all right, from General Pompey, and held out for 3 months. Their piety, we are told, helped Pompey to overcome them. For perceiving that they would not fight on the Sabbath, he had his men prepare unhindered on each Sabbath the mounds and battering rams for next day's assault. So like even the wicked Israelites, and we read this in the Maccabees, even the wicked Israelites still kept the Sabbath. And even the wicked Israelites who allied themselves with the Edomites, with the Greeks at that time and with the Romans of this time, said, hey, look, don't fight against us on the Sabbath. Please, just lay honor to the Sabbath. Give honor to the Sabbath. But Pompey didn't care, all right? Meanwhile, let's get page 531. Meanwhile, the priests offered the usual prayers and sacrifices in the temple, while Pompey is destroying the temple or destroying walls of the temple to get in to slaughter these Jews. When the ramparts fell, 12,000 Jews were slaughtered. Few resisted, none surrendered. Many leaped to death from the walls. Pompey ordered his men to leave the treasures of the temple untouched. but he exacted an indemnity of 10,000 talents, which is, $3.6 million of when Wystan was writing this, all right, from the nation. The cities that the Hasmoneans had conquered were transferred from the Judean to the Roman power. So that's how you ended up with Judea, a Roman province, instead of a Roman protectorate, right? There's a difference, because Simon and Jonathan and Judas had established the league with Rome that Judea would be a protectorate and not just another province, all right? But in all this, the descendants of Simon, you ended up, with wicked men, and they fell to Rome. All right, Hyrcanus II was made high priest and nominal ruler of Judea, but as the ward, meaning the servant of Antipater the Idumean, who had helped Rome, the independent monarchy was ended, and Judea became part of the Roman province of Syria. You see that right there? So, Antipater is where you get Herod from. Herod was an Edomite. Of those Edomites, Antipater was of those Edomites who Hyrcanus had forced to start becoming Jewish, all right, to become Jews, all right. In 54 BC, Crassus, on his way to play the part of Pentheus at Ctesiphon, robbed the temple of the treasures that Pompey had spared, amounting to some 10,000 talents. When news came that Crassus had been defeated and killed, the Jews took the opportunity to reclaim their freedom. Longinus, successor of Crassus as governor of Syria, suppressed the revolt and sold 30,000 Jews into slavery, and that was 43 BC. Put them on slave ships. All right, send them to Rome, send them to other parts of the Mediterranean. All right. In that same year, Antipater died in 43 BC. The Parthians swept across the desert into Judea and set up as their puppet king Antigonus, the last of the Hasmoneans. All right, and that's where you see this right here. Antigonus, the last of the Hasmoneans. That's all the way down here. All right, Antigonus right here. Let's get back to it. Where are we at? Here we go. All right. Antigonus, the last of the Hasmoneans. There we go. Antony and Octavian countered by naming Herod, son of Antipater, king of Judea, and financing his Jewish army with Roman funds. Herod drove out the Parthians, protected Jerusalem from pillage, sent Antigonus to Antony for execution, slew all Jewish leaders who had supported the puppet, and so auspiciously entered upon one of the most colorful reigns in history, and started in 37 to 4 BC. So even when Antony and Octavian, that's Augustus, if you recall, were at each other's throats, striving to be the dictator of Rome, the new ruler of Rome, they still agreed to ordain Herod, all right, over Judea. He said, look, we can't let these Jews get crazy no more. We can't let them, fight against us no more. We're going to establish an Edomite to rule over them. All right, and they took out Antigonus, the last of the Maccabean family. All right, and just in case you were wondering, his character, meaning Herod, his character was typical of an age that had produced so many men of intellect without morals, ability without scruple, and courage without honor, if you could even have such a thing. Herod was the devil. And that's what we're going to pick up with when we start reading about the history of Christ next week. Herod is the one who tried to kill him. Herod the Great, who they call Herod the Great, ruled from 37 BC to 4 BC. He's the one who tried to kill Christ as a child. All right? And we're going to pick up with that history next week.